The first time Margaret mentioned her idea at the town meeting, you could have heard a pin drop in the silence that followed. Then came the laughter, not the polite kind that acknowledges a clever joke, but the sort that dismisses something as utterly ridiculous before it even has a chance to breathe. A double cabin, Tom Henderson had said, wiping tears from his eyes. Margaret, honey, you've been alone too long up there on that mountain. The cold's gotten to your brain. The others had joined in, their voices overlapping in a chorus of well-meaning condescension. They told her she was wasting her time, that her late husband Robert's cabin was perfectly fine as it was, that she should sell the property and move down into town where a woman her age belonged. Margaret had sat quietly through it all, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her gray eyes steady and calm. She had expected this reaction. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she had spent the last 3 winters slowly freezing in that cabin, burning through cord after cord of expensive firewood, watching her savings dwindle as the mountain wind howled through gaps she couldn't find and couldn't fix. Robert had built their cabin 30 years ago with his own 2 hands, and it had been beautiful then, tight and warm and full of promise. But Robert had been gone for 5 years now, and the cabin had aged faster than either of them ever had. The chinking between the logs had cracked and fallen away in places. The windows, single, paned and original to the build, let cold air seep in around the frames no matter how much weather stripping she applied. The roof, while still structurally sound, seemed to let the heat rise right through it and disappear into the Montana sky. Last winter had been the worst. Margaret had taken to sleeping in layers of clothes, wearing Robert's old work coat to bed, and still she would wake with frost on the inside of the windows and her breath visible in the bedroom. The wood stove in the main room could barely keep up, and heating the bedroom was impossible. She had spent entire days feeding that stove, going through her woodpile at an alarming rate, and still the cold had seeped into her bones until she ached with it. But Margaret was not a woman who gave up easily. She was a problem solver, always had been. Robert used to joke that she could fix anything with enough time and determination. So instead of moving to town, as everyone suggested, instead of abandoning the home where she and Robert had raised their daughter and lived their best years, she had begun to research. She read everything she could find about insulation, about heat retention, about traditional building methods from cold climates around the world. She spent hours at the library in town, going through old journals and architectural magazines, taking notes in her careful handwriting. That's when she discovered the double cabin concept. It was an old Scandinavian technique, she learned, something Norwegian and Swedish settlers had brought to America generations ago, but that had been largely forgotten as modern insulation became available. The principle was elegantly simple. Instead of trying to insulate a single cabin wall, you built a second cabin around the first one, leaving a gap between the 2 structures. That air space, properly managed, would act as insulation far superior to anything you could stuff into the walls. The outer cabin would bear the brunt of the weather, while the inner cabin stayed protected and warm. The more she read, the more excited she became. This could work. This could actually work, and she could do most of the work herself. She was certain of it. She had helped Robert build additions to the cabin over the years, had learned to handle tools and lumber, had always been strong for her size. She wasn't afraid of hard work, never had been. But when she had presented the idea at the town meeting, hoping to find perhaps a few people who might help, or at least offer advice, she had been met with that laughter, with the gentle, patronizing suggestion that she didn't know what she was talking about. with Tom Henderson offering to buy her property for half what it was worth because, as he put it, it's going to fall down anyway, might as well get something for it now. Margaret had driven home that night in her old truck, up the winding mountain road to her cabin, and sat for a long time in the darkness looking at her home. The moon was bright enough that she could see the outline of the logs, the peaked roof, the porch where she and Robert had spent countless evenings watching the sun set over the valley. She thought about giving up, about taking Tom's offer, about moving into one of those little apartments in town where the heat came from a central system, and all you had to do was adjust a thermostat. But then she thought about Robert, about how he never let anyone tell him something couldn't be done. She thought about the years they had spent here, the life they had built, and she thought about those long, cold winters, and knew that she couldn't face another one like the last. If the town wouldn't help, she would do it herself. She would prove them all wrong. The next morning, she began. She started by carefully measuring the existing cabin, creating detailed drawings of every dimension. Then she staked out the footprint of the new outer cabin, planning for a 2-foot gap all the way around. 2 feet of air space would be enough, she had read, especially if she could manage it properly, with ventilation at the bottom and top to prevent moisture buildup. The lumber was the biggest expense, and the hardest part to manage alone. She couldn't afford to hire the project done, couldn't afford to buy all the materials at once. So she came up with a plan. She would buy materials bit by bit as she could afford them, and she would build in sections. She would start with the north wall, the one that took the worst of the winter wind, and work her way around. That first day of actual building, when she began setting posts for the new foundation, her nearest neighbor, old Henry Walsh, stopped by. He had heard about her plan and had come, she thought, to talk her out of it. Instead, he stood watching her work for a long while before speaking. "You're serious about this," he said finally. "I am," Margaret replied, not stopping her work. "They're all saying you've lost your mind. They've said that before about other things. I'm still here." Henry was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I've got some cedar posts I'm not using, good ones. You could have them if you want." Margaret looked up at him then, saw something in his weathered face that might have been respect. "I'd appreciate that, Henry. I'll pay you what I can. Don't worry about it," he said. "Robert helped me out more times than I can count. Consider it a debt repaid. That was the beginning." Henry brought the posts the next day, and while he didn't offer to help with the building itself, he was too old for that kind of labor, he said. He did offer advice. He had built plenty in his day, and his suggestions on how to brace the walls, how to make sure everything was level and square, were invaluable. Margaret worked every day that summer. She woke with the sun and worked until dark, stopping only for water and simple meals. Her hands developed new calluses on top of old ones. Her back ached constantly. She was 60, 3 years old, and building a cabin by herself, and some days it felt impossible. But she kept going. The walls went up slowly, board by board. She used a technique called board and batten, which was easier to do alone than trying to manage long horizontal logs. Vertical boards nailed to the frame with narrower battens covering the gaps between them. It was traditional, it looked good, and most importantly, she could handle the materials herself. As summer turned to fall, people began to notice that the Crazy Widows project was actually taking shape. Some drove up the mountain road just to look, parking at a distance and watching her work. She could feel their eyes on her, could imagine their conversations. "Still at it," they would say. "Wait until winter comes, then she'll give up." But Margaret had no intention of giving up. She had the north wall complete by October, and the east wall mostly done. She worked faster as the weather grew colder, knowing she was in a race against winter. The west wall went up in November, and she started on the south wall even as the first snows came. That's when Sarah Chen showed up. Sarah was relatively new to the area, a young carpenter who had moved to Montana from Seattle looking for a quieter life. She had heard about Margaret's project and was curious. Unlike the others, she didn't think it was crazy. In fact, she thought it was brilliant. "I've read about this," Sarah said, examining Margaret's work with professional interest. "Double wall construction, it's making a comeback in high efficiency building. You're basically creating a super-insulated envelope." "I don't know about all that," Margaret said. "I just need to stay warm. Can I help?" Sarah asked. "I mean, if you want help. I understand if this is something you need to do yourself." Margaret looked at this young woman with her bright eyes and her enthusiasm, and something in her chest loosened just a little. "I could use help with the roof," she admitted. "That's going to be the hard part." Sarah came back the next day with her tools, and the two women worked together to complete the south wall. Then they tackled the roof, which was indeed the hardest part. Margaret's plan was to build the new roof high enough that there would be an airspace above the original roof as well, creating insulation from above. It required careful engineering to make sure the new roof could support snow loads while being supported only by the outer walls. Sarah's expertise was crucial here, and together they designed a system of trusses that would do the job. They worked through November and into December. Other people, seeing that the project was actually nearing completion, began to stop by. Some offered materials they had lying around. Others offered advice, though Margaret and Sarah had learned to sort the useful suggestions from the ignorant ones. A few, very few, offered actual help. The roof went on during a cold snap in mid-December. Margaret and Sarah worked in temperatures below freezing, their breath clouding the air, their fingers stiff inside their gloves. But they got it done. The outer cabin was complete, wrapped around the original cabin like a protective shell. The final steps were the most important. They installed vents at the bottom of the air gap to allow air circulation and prevent moisture problems. They added vents at the top as well, under the eaves of the new roof. They installed a new door in the outer wall, creating an airlock effect with the original door. They even built a small addition off the south side, a mudroom where Margaret could store wood and remove her snowy boots before entering the house proper. By the time they finished, it was 2 days before Christmas. Margaret stood outside in the snow, looking at her home. It looked different now, larger, with the vertical board, and batten siding making it look almost like a small lodge. But it was still her home, Robert's cabin, safe inside this new protective layer. "Well," Sarah said, standing beside her. "Moment of truth, let's see if it works." They went inside, and Margaret started a fire in the wood stove. It was a modest fire, nothing like the roaring blazes she had needed the previous winter. Then they waited. Within an hour, the main room was comfortably warm. Within 2 hours, the warmth had spread to the bedroom without any additional heating. Margaret walked around her cabin in wonder, feeling the steady, even temperature, noticing that there were no cold spots, no drafts, no places where icy air snuck through invisible gaps. That night she slept without Robert's coat, for the first time in years. She woke once in the darkness and lay there in her warm bed, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling it buff at the outer walls while the inner cabin remained calm and peaceful. She thought about Robert and wished he could see this, could see what she had done. She thought he would be proud. Word spread quickly. By New Year's, people were talking about how Margaret's cabin was always warm, how she barely seemed to use any wood, how she could be seen sitting on her porch in a light sweater, while everyone else was huddled inside their houses, cranking up their heating systems. Tom Henderson drove up one particularly cold day in January. Margaret watched him park his truck and walk around the outside of the cabin, examining the construction. When he knocked on the door, she invited him in. He stood in her warm main room, feeling the comfortable temperature, noting the small fire in the stove that was somehow heating the entire space. "I'll be damned," he said finally. "It actually works." "It does," Margaret agreed. "How much wood are you going through?" "About a third of what I used last winter. Maybe less." Tom shook his head slowly. "We shouldn't have laughed at you." "No," Margaret said calmly. "You shouldn't have. Would you?" He hesitated. "Would you show me how you did it? I've got a cabin up on the North Ridge that's cold as hell. Costs me a fortune to heat." Margaret smiled. "I'll do better than that. I'll help you build one." Over that winter and into the spring, Margaret's cabin became something of a wonder. People came from all over the county to see it, to understand how it worked. The local newspaper ran a story about the widow who built a cabin within a cabin and cut her heating costs to almost nothing. Sarah Chen started getting calls from people wanting to hire her to build similar structures or retrofit their existing buildings. Margaret, for her part, became a teacher. She showed people her plans, explained the principles, helped design adaptations for their specific situations. She and Sarah worked together on several projects that spring and summer, helping others implement variations of the double wall system. But the most satisfying moment came late the following winter, almost exactly a year after she had first presented her idea at the town meeting. There was another town meeting, and this time when Margaret walked in, people made space for her, greeted her warmly, treated her like the expert she had become. Tom Henderson stood up and addressed the room. "I think we all owe Margaret an apology," he said. "Last year we laughed at her idea. We thought she was crazy. Turns out she was the only smart one in the room. My heating bills are down 60% since Margaret helped me retrofit my cabin. And that's not even the best part. The best part is that my cabin is comfortable now. Really comfortable all the time. No cold spots, no drafts, just steady warmth. It's changed everything." Others spoke up, sharing similar experiences. The room that had once been full of laughter at her expense was now full of gratitude and respect. Margaret sat quietly through it all, the same way she had sat quietly through the laughter the year before. When they asked her to speak, to explain her process, she stood and faced them all. "I'm not special," she said. "I just had a problem and I found a solution. The knowledge was out there, waiting to be found. Old techniques that worked for generations, that we forgot about when we thought we had better modern ways. Sometimes the old ways are better. Sometimes we just need to be willing to look for answers instead of accepting that things can't be better than they are." She paused, looking around the room. "And sometimes we need to be willing to listen when someone has an idea, even if it sounds strange at first, even if the person sharing it is just a widow who lives alone on a mountain. Everyone has something to teach if we're willing to learn." That spring, Margaret planted a garden in front of her cabin, in the space between the outer and inner walls on the south side. The reflected heat from the inner cabin and the protection from the outer cabin created a warm microclimate where plants thrived. She grew tomatoes and peppers and herbs, things that normally struggled in Montana's short-growing season. It was one more benefit she hadn't anticipated, one more gift from her double cabin. Sarah Chen became a regular visitor, and then more than that. She became a friend, the daughter Margaret's own daughter might have been if life hadn't taken her to distant cities and career opportunities. They worked together on various projects, and Sarah learned not just about building, but about perseverance, about believing in yourself when others don't, about the satisfaction of solving problems with your own hands. On warm evenings, Margaret would sit on her porch, the one between the two walls, and watch the sun set over the valley just as she and Robert had done so many years ago. The cabin stayed warm in winter and cool in summer, the air gap protecting it from temperature extremes in both directions. Her heating costs remained minimal, her comfort remained high, and her sense of accomplishment, of having proven the doubters wrong, never faded. Years later, when researchers from the State University came to study energy, efficient housing solutions for cold climates, they cited Margaret's cabin as a perfect example of practical low-cost efficiency. They measured and documented everything, wrote papers about it, taught the principles to their students. Margaret gave them tours and answered their questions, always ending with the same advice. Don't let anyone tell you something can't be done until you've tried it yourself. The town eventually put up a small historical marker near her property, noting the Walsh double cabin as an example of innovative vernacular architecture. Margaret thought Robert would have gotten a kick out of that, his cabin becoming famous not for how he built it, but for what she built around it. On the coldest nights, when the temperature dropped below zero and the wind screamed down from the mountain peaks, Margaret would lie in her warm bed and listen to the storm rage against the outer walls. She would feel the absolute calm and comfort of her inner sanctuary, and she would smile in the darkness. They had laughed at the widow's double cabin idea, but the widow was warm, warmer than any of them, and she had done it herself. That was worth all the laughter in the world.